Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I can see Nader and I can see Madian, so I'm assuming there'll be more people coming, inshallah. If not, then this is a good number, witr. We can have a odd number, inshallah. Um, as I always do, mostly for myself, just to ready myself in any capacity whenever I'm talking. I'm just going to make my intentions and inshallah invite all of you as well. So, Nawaitul ilm ta'lim, intend true knowledge, and all true knowledge is a knowledge of disclosure. And disclosure informs us who we are and who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is and what that entails. And we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala open up for us knowledge that is ilmun nafi', beneficial, that we can benefit ourselves and benefit others, or for ifada wal istifada, in service of ourselves and in service of others. And we hold firm to the sources of Islam, the Quran and Sunnah, the inward and the outward, through the hearts that have been connected to the hearts that are connected all the way back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we intend this ibtigha'a li wajhillah, purely and utterly for the sake of Allah, la li shay'in duna. So with these general intentions, I'm just going to invite everyone here, those listening in the future as well, inshallah ta'ala, if this gets uploaded, just to make these intentions in your hearts and others in the seeking of this knowledge. So we'll just go in just for half a minute and then we'll start. فاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. آمين. So I'll start by thanking Sidi Abu Madian for inviting me to be part of this series. A series of lectures, part of his channel and this outlet for discussions in Islamic philosophy. And today's talk will be kind of an introduction to my book, which has just come out. So the book is called Sulūk and the Way Return. So I don't know if you can see it. It's, I think, Charlotte, with your permission, Abu Madian, maybe I'll forward some links that can go into the comment section. That can be later uploaded. So I'm just checking in because I think I can see you're frozen. Can everyone hear me?
نعم سيدي كناية.
Yeah, everyone hear me? Okay, because I think Abu Madian got frozen slightly. Okay, so inshallah ta'ala, at some point, maybe in the future, we'll give a link to the actual book, and people can follow and purchase the book for themselves. So Abu Madian asked me to speak a bit about this book, and I guess the first place to start is mention what it is, and it's basically my PhD thesis. And at the outset, when I was thinking of dedicating myself to study something over a series of years, I knew that it would have to be something that pulls me, that gives me a sense of interest. And for me, that was the sense of wanting to spend time with the tradition of the Ḥikam, of IbnʿAṭāʻAllāh. And so I remember reading in one of the earliest translations, and still probably is one of the most significant translations of the Ḥikam by Victor Danner, which was his PhD, an allusion to the significance of the structure of the aphorisms. And in that structure, he said that each individual aphorism is as if it was a jewel, but there's a common thread that connects it. And so in his positing of what the thread was, there was an allusion to, Dana states that whilst the Hikam can be likened to a necklace of precious jewels, he said that this common thread was illuminative gnosis or ma'rifah that constitutes the inner thread holding the many jewels in place and giving to the work its underlying perspective and unity. So what I found interesting was that it was very clear that Victor Dana was highlighting that the aphorisms themselves have an innate connectivity. And this is something I was made aware of in my own reading of the Hikam with certain teachers from the Shadli lineage who would emphasize that the specific arrangement of the aphorisms is for the position or to teach suluk, teach spiritual wayfaring. And they mention this in the context of certain commentators who would otherwise change the order of the aphorisms. And so this made me interested in exploring as to, is there a way we can explicitly support what Victor Dana was basically stating from his position of obviously familiarity with the text, but is there a way we can adopt a form of methodology by which we read the aphorisms, this classic of Islamic spirituality, and provide a form of textual analysis that supports this claim that there is a deliberate form of meaning intended in the arrangement of the aphorisms. And it was specifically for that purpose that I started looking into the commentarial tradition. Because just as Victor Dana made that statement elsewhere, Martin Links also in his introduction to Victor Dana's published PhD says that the main theme of the Hikam is gnosis or ma'rifah. And he says bound up with this theme is the theme of adab, which when it is a Sufi term may be translated as pious courtesy, insofar as gnosis is not merely an act of the intelligence, rather it demands a total participation, and adab in its highest sense is the conformity of the soul in all its different facets to the divine presence. So beyond the inferences of someone like Martin Links or Victor Dana, they didn't provide any textual analysis of the Hikam to support their inferences. They didn't provide any textual analysis of the Hikam to support their conclusion. So rather what Victor Dana does is he alludes to a potential pathway by which such textual analysis could be conferred. And he states that it would be the commentators from the same Shadli lineage of the Hikam who are best qualified to illustrate the jewel-like structure of its macro theme. And this, he says, because in his book he says, is because they have adherence to the same spiritual school, which allows for a homogeneity of perspective and orientation. So that exact quote, let's see if I can find it, page 16 to 17. Yeah. So he says, so he says basically the best way, generally, the commentators of the Hikam have been of the Shadli line. And this is because of a certain homogeneity of outlook, which results, and this makes for an easier comprehension of the work, inasmuch as the technical terminology, istalahat, in it is gone over time and time again. So he has this kind of inference, and he says, that so this is why it was used as a teaching tool within the Shadli lineage. So given that pointer from him, I specifically chose the Īqāẓ al-Himam. I chose a commentary because I felt the commentaries on the Ḥikam would be most illustrative in terms of allowing us to unpack the particular structure. And why did I kind of narrow in on the Īqāẓ is because out of all of the um, commentaries on the Ḥikam, the Īqāẓ I felt, firstly, it had the same characteristics alluded to by Dana, in that it was by a master and someone within the Shadi lineage, but it was probably, and this is something supported by my direct teachers within the Shadi lineage, but it was also from a historical point of view, it was coming about at the exact same moment on the aftermath of the colonization of the Maghrib and the Islamic milieu or the world that would produce the kind of author of the Īqāẓ, which is Ibn ʿAjībah al-Hasani, would not be easy to be found in terms of a pedagogical system, because that world would be dismantled. And Ibn ʿAjībah's commentary to this day stands out as amongst various masters, spiritual masters, as being like a commentary par excellence in this regards. So that's why I chose the Īqāẓ. So basically, I chose, so just to summarize and just briefly go into what my PhD thesis was ultimately about, it was to use the Īqāẓ as a way of deciphering through textual analysis, what is this key thread? What is this overall theme that is connecting all of the Ḥikam? So does anyone have any questions on that before I jump to the next phase, which was having decided upon the Īqāẓ, what was the methodology I chose? Does anyone any questions on that? We're a small group here, so I can see at least two people I know, apart from over Madian. Nadir, can you hear me? Just checking in because
Yes, I do.
okay, so you've been hearing me throughout, because I think there's been a
Yeah,
bit
yeah.
of
It's
freezing happening.
it's clear.
Okay,
It's
good.
clear. There are no issues on
Yeah.
mine.
Okay, so I think Abu Madin, it might be your connection, because they're here. I think if everyone else is hearing me, then it might just be the connection. So okay, so no questions. Then I'll just jump into the second part, which is having decided to do the Īqāẓ, and why specifically I chose the Īqāẓ is I've kind of alluded to that. Um, Having decided to choose the Īqāẓ, um, is everyone familiar with the Īqāẓ? Just as a quick point here, Muhammad Mustafa, I can see you.
Hey, Salam. No, I'm not. I
Okay,
don't
you're
know
not.
much about it.
Okay, so the Īqāẓ is called Īqāẓ al-Himam, which means the raising of the spiritual aspirations. And it is a commentary done by Ibn ʿAjībah al-Hasani, as I said, who is he was the end of the 18th century, passed away early 19th century, and he was a master who lived in Maghrib, in Morocco, and he was part of the Darqawi lineage. And so Ibn ʿAjībah's commentary, Īqāẓ al-Himam, generally is considered to be the most expansive um, spiritual commentary on the Ḥikam. If we look at some of the teachers within the Shadi lineage, so for example, Sheikh Abdurrahman Shahuri, who was the spiritual teacher of and the guide of Sheikh Nuh Hamim Kala and Sheikh Muhammad Yaqubi, amongst others. And he has a quote where he says that the Īqāẓ has something in it for people at all stages of the path. So people at the beginning, the middle, and the end. Um, And so the idea is that the Īqāẓ is one of the most comprehensive of the commentaries. And so I chose Īqāẓ for that reason, also because of my familiarity with it was that I directly was studying the Īqāẓ with a teacher in Abu Dhabi. I was familiar with various teaching circles of the Īqāẓ. So it was a text that I was personally engaged with. And so this is why I chose the Īqāẓ al-Himam. Does that help, Sidi Mustafa?
Yep, very clear. Thank you.
Okay. So having chosen the Īqāẓ, the next question for me was, and this is something that happens within PhDs, is that you have to delineate your methodology, right? What is your hermeneutics? What is the way by which you're interpreting? And that's a broad term. So how you can't just approach a text, and I mean, as a personal level, you can say this is how the text appears to me, but from an academic perspective, you have to delineate a methodology by which you're approaching it. So if I'm going to be analyzing the Īqāẓ, I have to kind of see what way, at least as an academic methodology, I have to posit what particular method I'm using. So I was just discussing with Abu Madian that it was in that context that I employed what's known as semantic analysis. This was a method developed by the Japanese scholar Toshihiko Izutsu, who passed away in 1993. So Toshihiko Izutsu was a scholar of mysticism. He was also, for those of you interested, he was the teacher of William Chittick and William Chittick's wife. And he was someone who taught them whilst they were in Iran. So he was also teaching things like the Fusus al-Ḥikam, which is very interesting. But even though his own background was also as a Zen Buddhist practitioner, so he's got some interesting publications in sort of comparative mysticism, but in specific regards to the use of semantic analysis, he was also a philosopher of language. And his understanding in semantic analysis is that language consists of what he calls semantic fields, which are basically collections of interdependent words that are ordered and structured based on semantic conceptual associations. So to Izutsu, I'll just quote something from my PhD. He said that it was in studying these semantic relationships that the Weltanschauung, or the worldview of the people who use that language, can be discerned. And he was borrowing what's known as the linguistic relativity theory. If you were to search upon a Google search this or look into what that means, there's two levels of this theory. There is a stronger form, and then there is a more weaker form. So the stronger form was discounted. The stronger form was basically almost positing an absolute determinism between language and a worldview, whereas the weaker form was saying that language, amidst other factors, helps illustrate the worldview. And this was the position of what came to be known as the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis, because of named after two linguists who proposed it. So Izutsu was building on that theory, and he specifically applied that theory in a book called God and Man in the Quran, the Semantics of the Quranic Weltanschauung. And he also did it, I was just discussing, I think, another book with Abu Madian called Ethico-Religious Concepts in the Quran. What was interesting was Izutsu's methods were already being employed by different people, specifically in the use of the analysis of Sufi texts. So there was I think, a Dominican monk by the name of Giuseppe Scatulin, who builds on using Izutsu's methods in very much the same way that I was intending on doing in analyzing Sufi texts. So he actually wrote a paper called Reading Sufi Texts, Some Hermeneutical Insights. And in that, he specifically said that we should use Izutsu's method in the analysis of Sufi literature at 3 levels. So the first, and this builds on the semantic analysis method, which is that there is a what they call the first level, which is the synchronic or the contextual analysis. So this is a level where you're just looking at linguistic terms as they mean at a period of time. And then the second level is the historical or diachronic analysis, which is an analysis of the same terms as they develop as ideas of a period of time. So you're now rooting those meanings in a historical continuity of tradition. And the third is what he called, the third level was the meta-historical or the transcendental level of reading. And in this, he said that whilst you're approaching these kind of linguistic methods to try and be as objective as possible, the goal, right, beyond this kind of hope to have an objective, what he called historical phenomenological reading, is still is to move beyond this exterior approach into a kind of what he called meta-historical or transcendental. In other words, to allow for those Sufi texts to give a transmission of experience, because that's ultimately what they're written for. Sufi texts are not written for this kind of dry analysis where, you know, you're historically analyzing the word. They're written generally so that the same meaning that was in the hearts of the authors are sought to be transmitted to those who read it. And this is what he called these transcendental. So obviously from an academic perspective, the method that I took was that I would do the synchronic, which is basically a kind of a linguistic analysis. And this is when I actually do what Toshihiko Izutsu says, which is to take terms, find the interrelated meanings under broad analytical categories, and I made those categories the categories of teleology, which is from a sense of a goal, ontology and soteriology. So ontology was the nature of being. So what is being transmitted in this text from a nature of being. Soteriology generally means kind of the sense of salvation, but here it's kind of like what is the ultimate, what is being sought from a position of that engagement with this literature, in the sense of not so much salvation in the next world, but in the sense of what we call sa'ada, this sense of bliss, what is being sought in this sense of in this imminence of ma'rifah. And then the last category was epistemology, which was the theory of knowledge and how things are known. So collectively, I chose these analytical categories because to me, they connected within the broad theme of what's called mabdaʼ al-maʿād, the origin and the return, because I felt that was a summation of much of what is being sought to be transmitted through the Īqāẓ. So does anyone have any questions with this methodology? Riva, you've said, is there a complete translation of Īqāẓ al-Himam in English? That's a good question to ask. At the time of my doing the PhD, there wasn't, and I still believe there isn't. It was very interesting. I met Sheikh Abdul Haq Bewley. Some of you may know him. He is the husband of Aisha Bewley and a part of the Murabitun community in Norwich. I think he's now in Bradford. So I actually didn't meet him in person. I had a conversation with him on the phone. And to the best of my knowledge, I believe he had translated either a lot of it or a large part of it. And his wife also has translated a part of it that is accessible on the net, Aisha Bewley's translation. I know that Sheikh Abdul Haq's, much of his translations have recently come out through Darqawa Press. I think literally only a few months ago. So you might be able to find it. But it's still not a complete translation of the Īqāẓ al-Himam. So I do believe Khalid Williams may have translated a significant amount of Iqāḍ al-Himam, but I need to check if it's a full translation. So the short answer is, to the best of my knowledge, there still isn't, which is a kind of a strange thing for me, because compared to some of the other, I mean, it's not a super large text. It's not. It's kind of a medium-sized text by some of the other literature that has been translated, but it is a bit more esoteric, perhaps, than Ibn Rundi's, for example, translation, commentary on the Ḥikam, which also I don't think has been fully translated yet, which is, it's a mystery for me as to why some of these commentaries have not been fully translated. Maybe some of you can correct me otherwise. Zainun Hisham, he says, is this methodology applied exclusively to Sufi literature? Can it be used to other types of texts? Well, as I was outlining, Toshihiko Izutsu applies it to the Quran. So it can be applied to any Sufi text or any text in general, because the idea is that it is a way of bringing a degree, and I have to qualify a degree because it's not a scientific method in the sense of falsifiability, because there is still a degree of subjectivity in your framing of the semantic fields. But what it does is it introduces a degree of transparency, so that the person who's doing the interpreting and positing his theories or his methodology can clearly demonstrate why he's coming to this conclusion. As if you, I don't know if you were here at the beginning, Zainun, when I was discussing what motivated me, and one of the things that motivated me was people like Victor Danner or Martin Lings were positing that there is a connecting theme in the Ḥikam, and both of them said ma'rifah. Martin Lings said ma'rifah connected with adab. And what I wanted to show was, can this be demonstrated? Now, can it be demonstrated objectively so that everyone's going to arrive at that thing? I don't think linguistic interpretation works like that. There always is a degree of subjectivity. But can there be a degree of objectivity? And this is where semantic analysis comes in that you are demonstrating a methodology of extracting words into semantic fields. Now, maybe I'll make it easier for you in the sense that if you were to look, for example, in God and Man in the Quran, what Toshihiko Izutsu says is that the word kufr has often been translated, for example, if you look around, especially when people were coming from outside the Islamic tradition, and they were translating the word kufr as infidel. And that word itself, the word infidel, has a whole, it's an alien word to the Islamic discourse that actually has a kind of worldview of excommunication and a kind of dogmatic exclusion that is actually rooted in some forms of Christian kind of persecution of other people who would otherwise be deemed as heretics. Now, there's a certain resonance when someone reads the word kafir as being translated as infidel. And even today, you find certain non-Muslims coming to people and saying, "You think I'm an infidel, don't you? I'm an infidel," because it's an insulting term. Whereas Toshihiko Izutsu said the meaning field of kufr can be arrived at through the term that is often paired as an opposite to it. And there are literal verses that say either you are in a state of kufr or you are in a state of shukr. So the dominant meaning field of kufr is known through the opposite. So if shukr is on one side, then kufr is actually posited not in the capacity of some kind of infidelity, of some kind of excommunication, but in a fundamental sense of being in a state of lack of gratitude. And then that opens up other dimensions, because how can it be a lack of gratitude? And then you look into other meanings associated around kufr. Like, what does kufr mean in the same sense of covering up? Because kufr is the same word used to cover up something. And so what is being covered up there? And then there's an idea of being that is being given to you by God, this sense of what should be an innate gratitude to the sense of being given being by God is now being occluded by a lack of recognition. And so that lack of recognition now, by covering up the very reality of who you are, results in an innateness of lack of gratitude. Now, all of this can be arrived at just by connecting the terms with where they're used and their opposites. Now, this is why what Toshihiko Izutsu does for the Quran, and that's very similar to what I was trying to do with the Īqāẓ al-Himam. So, does that help, Zainun? Okay, yeah. So what's interesting is, as I was saying also, it's not that this method is without critique, because Fazlur Rahman, who is also a very influential scholar in the Islamic studies space, I think he taught at University of Chicago, critiqued Toshihiko Izutsu's method by saying that even in your development of the fields, there could be this bias whereby you end up reading into things what are your own pre-existing lens with how you interpret them, because your development of these fields, the reason why you're choosing them and you're aligning certain words could also just be through a degree of subjectivity. And I discussed this at the end of my thesis by saying, but that is exactly the point, in that there always is a degree of subjectivity. So this is what we're trying, when we're using these methods, we're trying to be as objective as possible in a way that allows for external analysis and criticism. So, and what I found was interesting is that Toshihiko Izutsu's method was used, as I said, by Giuseppe Scatolin, a Christian. I think he might be a monk as well as an academic on Islamic kind of studies. He used it for an analysis of Umar ibn al-Farid's poem Nazm al-Sulūk, commonly known as At-Ta'iyyat al-Kubra. And then he basically arrives, because the whole point is that whilst you develop these fields consisting of reciprocal relationships, then what emerges out of them is a macro structure that reveals the central focus word or a focus phrase that can be applied across all of these fields. And this is what I was trying to get at, like, what is that central thread that can apply across all of the Ḥikam? So so this is what I did. And does anyone have any questions on that? Okay, good. So given that's the case, I just want to give a breakdown of what the book is. So chapter 1 introduces everything I was just saying. Like, what is my purpose of developing this? Why did I choose the Īqāẓ? What was the methodology that I adopted, which is semantic analysis? And what's the general structure of the thesis? So after that, I go into these two major levels of synchronic analysis, which is a linguistic analysis, and a diachronic analysis. So I do the diachronic analysis first, which is the historical analysis. So chapter 2 situates Ibn ʿAjībah and the Īqāẓ. So in that chapter, I discuss the nature of North Africa, Maghrib at its time, the evolution of the Shādi tariqa, the nature of the specific type of tasawwuf or Sufism that was being practiced by Ibn ʿAjībah, namely the Darqawiyya, the Shādi Darqawiyya. What was the political and social milieu of the Darqawiyya? Who were the prominent figures in the Darqawi tariqa? And then I go into a lot of discussion about the life of Ibn ʿAjībah and other writings that he had, and specifically focusing on how and when the Īqāẓ was written. And so that's kind of a diachronic analysis of Ibn ʿAjībah. And then I do another diachronic analysis or historical analysis of the themes and motives that are going to be used in the Īqāẓ. And this is when I focused on what's known as the Hikmah tradition, the tradition of wisdom, which itself is a kind of synthesis amongst prominent Sufis such as Junaid, Hakim al-Tirmidhi, and at some point this kind of crystallizes into this theme of fana and baqa, this theme of knowledge that takes you onto annihilation from the egoic self and a sense of subsistence in God. And then coupled with that are certain motives of light. And this then is further used in what's known as the Akbarian tradition of Ibn Arabi. And so all of these things kind of come into play before they're crystallized in Ibn Āģībah. And I kind of sketch out this kind of theme. And so the reason I'm mentioning this is in case anyone wants more discussion on this after I end in this broad summary. And then in chapter 4, I go into finding Ibn Āģībah's unique voice. Like, what is it that marks him out in his commentary? So his use of metaphorical language, his poetry, what are the delineators of how he is using the Ḥikam to indicate the structures. And they're very interesting because he uses something called semantic connectors. And there's certain Arabic particles that you know when you see them, he's actually going to give you like a something of his unique commentary. And then if you just focus on these words, you can etch out a broad kind of connection between the various Ḥikam, and specifically in what's known as the end of the chapters. And this also was a development that happened through the course of the Ḥikam, in that at a certain point, many of the commentators divided all of these aphorisms, which are roughly about 264, into 25 chapters. And what Ibn Āģībah does is at the end of each chapter, he gives his summary into that chapter and a connection to the chapter that follows. And so he's building his own commentary as a thread. And he had some very interesting things to say that allowed me to kind of unpack what I felt was the structure of the Īqāẓ, and that's in chapter 5 when I allude to how the Īqāẓ itself is actually playing on the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm, and by extension the Ḥikam is, because the Īqāẓ is saying that's what the Ḥikam is doing, which I don't think was a coincidence, because these motives were so ingrained within the Islamic psyche of these scholars, and this was a deeply, to them, even a deeply Quranic motive, in the sense that just as Surah Al-Fatiha is considered like an encapsulation of the entirety of the Quran at the level of meaning, they sought to simulate this even in some of the fact that, and I might as well come out with one of my thesis findings, which was that the first 2 chapters serve as microcosms to the rest of the 25 chapters. And the first chapter delineates the stage of fana, the second chapter delineates baqa, and this happens also so after the aphorisms, there's 4 rasail, or 4 letters, and this happens also in letter 1 and letter 2. And then after the rasail, there's a last bit called the colloquy, which is called munajat in Arabic. And the first part of it is fana, and the second part of it is baqa. So there's almost a echoing across the Īqāẓ in the spiritual path, which is taking us this journey of fana, and after this journey of fana, being in baqa. So this is kind of what I found, and I've kind of given my reasons for stating that through textual analysis, and inshallah, I'm open to different people's ideas. And after chapter 5, are there any new meanings you found in the Ḥikam using this manhaj that were not present in other commentaries of the Ḥikam? Well, this particular thing I've just outlined, I believe Ibn Āģībah alludes to it, but in the explicit way that I'm saying, I've not yet found any commentary of the Ḥikam explicitly state it. Does that help, Abu Madian? Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, so just my internet is not very stable. Yeah.
Okay, so I do believe that there's actually there's phrases by Ibn Āģībah which is literally saying the same thing. So, for example, at the end of the Risala, the first Risala, he says, or is it the second? I think it's the second. No, at the end of the second Risala, he says, or the second letter, he said, if there was only the first and the second letter in this book, that would suffice you from reading the rest of the book. So basically, he's saying this is like a microcosm to the rest of it. And if you read his conclusion to the first chapter, and you read his conclusion to the second chapter. So at the end of the first chapter, he says, وَلَمَّا أَدْخَلَكَ الْحَضْرَ, when he made you enter into the divine presence. He then guided you unto adab. What is adab with it? And in the second chapter, he says, this is the summation of all of the adab al-arifin. Like, what is the adab? To stay into this divine presence. So then by extension, the question becomes, what are the remaining chapters? Right? And then you see the remaining chapters from a textual analysis point of view are kind of like broad, you know, like if you take these adab in chapter 2 as being broad categories, and in Arabic we'd say jumla, a jumlatan, then these other chapters are kind of tafsili elaborations. They are elaborative kind of dimensions of these broad categories. And you see that in the thematic repetitions of the remaining chapters of some element of the themes within these first two chapters. Does that help, Abu Madian? So that's kind of where it's coming from. So if I was to say, have I seen specifically a commentary saying this explicitly? I haven't. But I've not seen a commentary answering the question that I set out in my PhD thesis, which is, what is the theme of connecting the Hikam? There's not a commentary. I mean, if you were to buy some of the Arabic editions, you'd see chapter headings. And some ulama have even written didactic poems connecting these broader themes across the chapters. But there isn't a, if someone says that this manhaj, this methodology is suluki, then the question would be, how can you prove that in terms of one broad macro theme? You say maybe a good way to check is the same with other shows. And actually I did. So it's not in this PhD thesis, but I did in the beginning. I had 3 tables. And so I'd have Ibn ʿAjībah, I'd have Ibn Badarundi, and I've had Sidi Ahmed Zarruq. And one of the reasons why Ibn ʿAjībah kind of still stands out is because, and this is something also, if you read the traditions, you'll find that, is that Ibn ʿAjībah already builds upon Ibn Badarundi and Sidi Ahmed Zarruq. So he literally at relevant moments would quote either of them. But neither Sidi Ahmed Zarruq or Ibn Badarundi have the deep intertextual analysis between the chapters that Ibn ʿAjībah has. And in fact, Ibn Badarundi doesn't have chapters. Sidi Ahmed Zarruq, it's from his point onwards that you have chapters. If you read Ibn Badarundi's commentaries, it's all like, because he's one of the earliest commentaries, and he didn't split the Hikam into different clusters based on a phrase, قال رضي الله عنه, which is this phrase, قال رضي الله عنه, was taken by later commenters like Sidi Ahmed Zarruq as to be a demarcator for a new gathering. So it's a new gathering, and this new gathering meant there's a new cluster of Hikam. So Ibn Badarundi doesn't even have the chapters. So obviously Ibn Badarundi's, the depth of his analysis is amazing, but from a position of this thematic connection, then he's already been, Ibn ʿAjībah is already taking from him, and then he's the one, actually, he's the closest that I've seen in terms of these traditional commentators, who's actually building these connections and then saying what is it that's giving them meaning. And so a lot of the muhakkikun, the editors who later on would give chapter headings, they're usually taking them from Ibn ʿAjībah. They're taking from Ibn ʿAjībah's analysis. Sidi Ahmed Zarruq, just for your own interest, Abu Madian and anyone else listening, was very interesting, is that Ibn ʿAjībah would sometimes quote verbatim from Sidi Ahmed Zarruq, but there's at least a couple of instances where he quotes him, and when Sidi Ahmed Zarruq is appearing to be critical or at least cautious with regards to Ibn Arabi, Ibn ʿAjībah, very interestingly, just leaves those quotes out, because Sidi Ahmad Zarruq's commentaries, when it comes to Ibn Arabi, he actually says that that it's better not to go there because, i.e., there's a mazalla, there's a potential slippery slope, and so tawaqquf is better. Whereas Ibn ʿajībah is very very upfront from the very beginning, because he has this muqaddimah, this introduction before he starts this commentary, and he gives the sources of his knowledge. This is another very interesting thing of the different sources he's using. So he uses the al-mabdaʿ al-ashra, the 10 categories of knowledge, and of what tasawwuf is, and where is he taking it from. And he very clearly says, Ibn Arabi, he uses him from his eponymic name al-Hatimi, and he says he says Ibn Arabi al-Hatimi is the source of his knowledge with regards to the manazil, or the different spiritual stations. So it's very interesting that he says that. But from a position of comparison with Sidi Ahmad Zarruq and Ibn Badarundi, I don't think, based on when I was initially doing that kind of cross comparison, that you'd get much more from them specifically for the position of the thematic connections or these broad themes between the hikam. Obviously, in the individual hikam, you would benefit from their knowledge, because in the individual hikam, they would, in their own unique ways, have some unique insights on the hikam. But this broader analysis, this is where Ibn ʿajībah really comes to the fore. Does anyone have any questions on that? Okay, this is interesting. Would it be possible to share how you found the themes of fana, baqa using linguistic analysis? Okay, so you want me to go into this. Okay. Structure of the Īqāẓ. So that's chapter 5, 181. This is actually a good topic because, as I said, this is something that is not that easily found. So I can give you my argument and you can let me know whether you think it's a good one. So let's see now. No. So so when looking at the 262 aphorisms divided into 25 chapters, chapters 1 and 2 particularly stand out in delineating this trajectory. Let's see if I can get the original, I'll just get the actual Īqāẓ with me here. So in this manner, it appears Ibn ʿajībah is I'm reading page 183 for those of you interested. In this manner, it appears Ibn ʿajībah is alluding to chapter 1 as detailing the journey towards fana, or the annihilation of oneself in God's presence, and of chapter 2 being its complementary return leg of baqa, detailing the way to subsist in that presence. So how do I state that? Let's see if I can find my evidence for it. Okay, so let's go to the end of chapter 1. Okay, so chapter 1 ends here. He says, at the end, after he's summarized everything about chapter 1, he actually does a breakdown of, he says, everything summarized in this book, a fadlakatun, which is the hasil, a hasil ما اشتمل عليه هذا الباب من أول الكتاب ثلاثة أمور. He says, so this book covers, this first chapter has 3 matters, and in that he says عمل الشريعة والطريقة والحقيقة, which is his breakdown of the 3 types of actions that are needed. And so he says, elsewhere he calls them Amlul Islam, wal Iman, wal Ihsan, wal Bidayah, wal Wasat, wal Nihaya. So in the first chapter itself, there is everything you need from the position of actions at the level of beginning, middle, and end. And then he breaks down which hikam do that. And so then after he's broken down all of them, and especially the last hikam being the raising of the veil, right? He says, ثُمَّ فَتَحَ لَكَ الْبَابِ وَرَفَعَ عَنْكَ الْحِجَابِ. This is all his summary of what the last hikam are doing. So then he says, then he opened for you the door and raised for you the veil. وَقَالَ لَكَ, and he said to you, هَا أَنْتَ وَرَبُّكَ. Here you are and here is your Lord. Now, if you have a connection to certain shuyukh, this is actually a phrase the shuyukh say is the goal of fana. The goal of fana is for the teacher to come unto you and say, here you are and here is your Lord. Ha anta wa rabbuka, or ha rabbuka wa la anta. To say, here is your Lord and here you are, or here is your Lord and here you aren't. Right. وَهُوَ قَوْلُهُ, and then he gives a breakdown of what they are. So he says, after that, he says, فَجَزَاهُ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنَ جَزَائِهِ. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give him the best of rewards. And then at the end, he says, وَلَمَّا أَدْخَلَكَ الْحَضْرَةِ. Right? What does that mean? When he entered you into the divine presence. What does that mean? That's fana. Right? رَفَعَكَ عَنْكَ الْحِجَابِ. He raised from you the veil. So how does the veil get lifted? How does the veil get lifted? What is the veil? Right? Junaid used to say that the veil that is lifted is فَيَفْنَى مَنْ لَمْ يَكُنْ. That which never was is annihilated. وَيَبْقَى مَنْ لَمْ يَزَلْ. And that who forever was, or he who forever was, remains. So the veil is the loss of me, because the big veil is me. That's what veils a person from being in the divine presence. وَلَمَّا أَدْخَلَكَ الْحَضْرَةَ دَلَّكَ عَلَىٰ عَدَابِهَا. He then guided you onto the manners in it. فَقَالَ فِي أَوَّلِ بَابِ الثَّانِي مُتَرْجِمًا عَنْهَا. And then he goes into why the next bab is from another chapter. So now the end of the first chapter is entering into divine presence. What's the second chapter? It's all about adabul arif, right? So that's why the whole thing is adab. And you can see, if you have a contextual reading, that he's not talking about just any adab, because from the very beginning, he starts off, he says, قُلْتُ مِنْ أَدَابِ الْعَارِفِ الْحَقِيقِي أَنْ يُقِرَّ أَشْيَاء فِي مَحَلِّهَا. So why is he saying, I say from the adab of the arif, from the proper propriety of the one who knows Allah, is that he gives everything its just due. So he's now already speaking from, in the second chapter, from the position of someone who's in the divine presence. Right? And that's why it's not a linear. Someone's expecting the hikam, chapter 1, okay, chapter 2 builds on from that, and chapter 3, and then we get crescendo right at the end. He's actually, in many ways, outlining what could be said to be his own spiritual path, and the path of what many Shadhlis consider to be spiritual path, because in delineating his own methodology elsewhere in the Īqāẓ, he says, our path is to enter people into divine presence min awwal khatwa, from the very first step, which effectively when they're ready. And then the rest of their path becomes adab, a way of conformity with what that divine presence demands of them. So it's joining between sulūk and jadab from the very first step. And given that he says that's what his path is, he's trying to mirror that, or he's seeing that's what IbnʿAṭāʻAllāh is doing through the very aphorisms themselves. And that's why if you look at the aphorisms, some of the last aphorisms at chapter 1 are actually some of the most, they call it ishraqi, illuminative aphorisms in the entire hikam. They're very, very difficult to unpack from an esoteric point of view. And they come right at the end of chapter 1. So, مما يدلك على وجود قهره سبحانه أن حجبك عنه بما ليس بموجود معه. From that which indicates his qahriya, his overpoweringness, is that he's veiled you with that which is not in existence alongside him. Like these kind of aphorisms. And then the last one is, how can it be considered that something veils him when he is the one who's brought everything into existence? So we were actually reading this with a class when we were going through the aphorisms, and it was very heavy, because it's all about saying there is no veil, there is no veil, there is no veil, there is no veil. So what is your phenomenological existence of there being a veil unto the ever-present, all-embracing manifestness of God is in itself an indication of his oneness. Because from any perspective, there is no veil. So this is what he's doing at this is analysis at the end of level of chapter 1. Now, if you go to the end of chapter 2, what does he say? Because the big, as I said, if you look at his conclusions at the end of independent aphorisms, they're pointers, and also conclusions at the end of the independent chapters. And now he says, after he says, وحاصل, the hasil, a summary of chapter 2, وحاصلها آداب العارف وعلاماته. The summary of the chapter 2 is the propriety that the arif needs and what are the signs by which you determine them. So then he says, فَالْآدَابُ ثَمَانِيَةٌ. Then the adab are 8 and the signs are 4. And how you unpack them also requires a certain type of, because he's not writing them in a very, you have to kind of determine where they end, what he means by the signs and the adab. But this summation of 8 adab and 4 signs of the arif is kind of a condensed form. After that, when you read the rest of them, they're just independent themes in terms of the chapters. There, for example, chapter 3 is التشوف إلى معرفة العيوب, to look for instead of looking for ma'rifah outwardly, you first want to look at what are the faults in me inwardly that are veiling me from it. So this is a dimension of looking at yourself. Then chapter 4 becomes something else, and like your companionship, which is chapter 5. So they're all independent themes under this kind of broad theme. And so you see that the chapters of the aphorisms are all independent themes that now are broadly under this broad themes of chapter 1 to the divine presence, chapter 2, what is the big broad categories of adab in that presence. Does that help, Riva? That's basically the aphorisms. As for the epistles, now why does he have 4 epistles? Why does he have 4 letters after the aphorisms? Dana says this was also a theme to kind of spark people into life, because you're reading the aphorisms, they're deep contemplative literature. Sometimes you just need a bit of variety to kind of spark another type of dimension. So the letters themselves are kind of there to stimulate another form of kind of awakeness in regards to engaging with this, because they're more expository. And in the letters, at the end of the second epistle, he says, and I might as well just read the translation, and this is what I was trying to get at when I was saying that he's very explicit here. So he says, and I'll try and find the actual Arabic as well, given that some of you are actually interested in this from a position of the Arabic. Yeah, so he says in the second letter, he says at the end, so at the end of so the first letter, he says, is بيان السلوك من أوله إلى آخره. فهو يكفي ذوي الألباب عن مطالعة كل كتاب. He says the first letter is a summation of suluk from the beginning and the end, and it suffices for people of innermost cause, i.e. hearts, from having to look at the rest of the book. So he's basically saying this first letter is another microcosm. Does that help, Riva? And at the end of the second letter, now he becomes, he says, 464, yeah, which is 421. He says, and I'll just paraphrase my translation here. So he says about this, the letter, this thing of they call it, this treatise is an exposition now, because I said the first letter now seems to be about fana again, second letter seems to be about baqa again, just like the first chapter is about fana and the second chapter is about baqa. So even though this second letter, he says, is about في بيان الوصول إلى بحر الحقيقة مع مراعاة حرمة الشريعة. He says, how can one be in the sea of absolute oneness whilst observing the sanctity of the Sharia? And the Sharia here is our adab with asbab. That's what he means with created forms of means, because he says this treatise is an exposition of arriving onto the ocean of ultimate reality, Bahr al-Haqiqah, whilst honoring the sanctity of the Sharia, including both of its ends, the tarafan, by which he means the entirety of the Sharia, right? For there are people who either may neglect it, or there are people who are made to neglect it because they're overcome by it, they're majdub. And then there are people who adopt the means and join between them, the Haqiqah and the Sharia. And so the end of the second epistle ends by highlighting the paradigm of shukr, which equates to dealing with the means, asbab, being the wisdom, hikmah behind the Sharia. And at the end of it, he says at 427, and this I'll end here for my example here. He says, فهذا آخر رسالة التي كتبها لبعض إخوانه. He said, this is the last of the treatise that he, Ibn-ʿAṭāʾAllāh, wrote to some of his brethren. And then he says, وهي في غاية الإتقان والكمال, and it is of the highest level of precision and perfection. He says, فلو لم يكن في هذا الكتاب إلا هذه رسالة. And so if there wasn't in this book nothing except this epistle or letter, then he says, مع التي قبلها, alongside the letter that came before it. Then he says, لكانت كافية, then it would have been sufficient. So do you see what he's doing? He's positing which ones are the microcosms and which ones are the macrocosms. So the two first letters are microcosms unto the entirety of the book. In his own words, if you read them properly, لكانت كافية. And then the first two chapters also are microcosms to the remaining aphorisms as well. So this kind of touches Riva. If you see what he's doing, it touches on that. But it's also interesting, and to go back to Madian, that at least in my reading of the Hikam, no one has then taken that into a theory to say this is the microcosm, that is the macrocosm, even though it could be inferred from his writings. Does that help? Yeah. And I think part of that is because when we read these texts, we're not necessarily reading these texts with those questions at the forefront, right? So when you read these texts, either we read them individually from a devotional perspective, or when we're reading them in majalis, on gatherings with mashayikh teachers who are teaching them, the main goal is to exposit the meanings of the suluk and based on sometimes individual aphorisms. And sometimes it's very difficult to kind of give that bird's eye image, just in the nature of how the discourse kind of progresses, because everyone goes from one gathering to another gathering, and then you kind of get immersed in that aphorism again. So so now I think I've preempted what this whole thesis was, and so just to let you know that I also ended up through my analysis coming at the focus word or the focus phrase being adab al-ma'rifah, but I kind of demonstrate it through these means of semantic analysis, which is what I've covered now as just being the first kind of chapters of structures, but then from chapter 6, I go into taking themes such as teleology, which just some of the topics we cover is what does it mean to wusul? What is the beginning? What is the arriving? What is the imperative for work? This clash between grace and works in Arabic, you'd say kasb wa wahab, acquisition through a state of doing something, and wahab of just pure grace. Or, there's a lot of emphasis of Ibn ʿAjībah on the nature of the ego and the remedy to loving the world and the nature of effort. This sense of light and darkness. And then chapter 7 goes into, so before that, also one of the things Ibn ʿAjībah covers a lot in teleology is the nature of necessary encounter with suffering. That suffering has to be something that the salik has to face along the spiritual path. And there are benefits in this facing of difficulty. And the goal is that to arrive at this kind of witnessing of God as the ultimate cure to all forms of distress. And then chapter 7, which is kind of, I joined between ontology and soteriology. which is kind of then looking into the whole nature of the veil. How does one remove this veil? What's the purpose of creation? This goes in very much into the those of you who are familiar with the Akbarian idea of the ontological descent, and then I call it the soteriological ascent. So it's the arc of descent, Qays al-Nuzuli, and then there's the arc of the ascent, and that's why I paired them together. So there's this idea of why did God create anything? And then this becomes also the nature of the purpose of creation and man. What is this dual capacity of humanity? What is, the idea of a human being being the barzakh, the interspace where God is effectively being known, and to himself, in the sense of allowing for his knowledge to be witnessed and seen. And so then the soteriological sense of traversing outward form to return back to the sa'ada. There's an interesting discussion Ibn ʿAjībah has between Jadab and Sulūk. He raises some very interesting points. There's some questions that come from that you wish he went into a bit more detail, but I think they kind of raised, because he uses some interesting terminology, and he says that the majdub might even, he uses the word qad yunkir, he might actually negate the Sharia, but inkar or means to actually almost be negating it from a position of actively non-engaging, so you're kind of opposing it almost. And he said that such a majdub could be doing that, but he could be beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the sense that his analogy is similar to the one whose the pen has been lifted from, but except that he's in a state of jadab because he's been pulled into the state of love. And so the suluk of the jadab is one of descending back to the world of form, whereas the way of suluk of the salik is to ascend from the world of from outward form to absolute oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said they both might meet somewhere in the middle. So it's a very interesting kind of discussion. And then at the end, we discuss epistemology, which is the different types of knowledge. What is mystic knowledge? Why is it Ibn ʿAjībah has this whole discussion, which is one of the largest discussions actually in the Īqāẓ, of what could be considered historical phenomena, which was the Mahna as-Sufiyya, the inquisition of the Sufis that happened in the time of Junayd, supposedly happened in the time of Junayd. And there's a few historical kind of interesting points that some might debate, but it's almost as if Ibn ʿAjībah is not using it from historical accuracy. He's using it more as a form of kind of alluding as to why often those who are most opposed to the Sufis have been ulama of esoteric knowledge. And that's why the actual inquisition of the Sufis and the Sayyidina Junayd was actually done at the behest of a Qadi who was jealous of Junayd and the Sufis. And he keeps building this example up. And in many ways, he's someone in that position because he was someone of tremendous outward scholarship. And then he only came to the spiritual path relatively late, close to 50, I think around about that age. And one of the reasons why it's kind of alluded to, if you read his biography, is because much of his outward learning was kind of gave him a sense of wariness to give himself unto the Sufis, even though he had read the Īqāẓ, he'd read the Ḥikam, especially Ibn Ba'd-ar-Rundi's commentary, and they had made a big influence on him. When he finally enters the spiritual path, it's not through some great discourse, it's because Buzaydi, who's becomes his spiritual master, alongside his grand Sheikh, Sheikh Darqawi, pulls him into what they call a majlis as-sama, pulls him into this gathering, and he's literally like transforms at that point. And Buzaydi himself, speaks to him and says, "What is it that you know?" And then he says, "All of this is exterior knowledge." And then about the interior, he said, "All of this is just still exterior," until he says, "Now you'll come to interior knowledge." And it's interesting that his primary teacher became Sheikh Buzaydi and not Sheikh Darqawi, who was still alive. Sheikh Darqawi was the Sheikh of Sheikh Buzaydi. But they say that because there was a more ecstatic dimension to Sheikh Buzaydi, and it was almost like to balance Ibn ʿAjībah's kind of scholarly persona, that there was this strong need of a sheikh who could pull him out of that into this inward dimension. And what pulls him out of that is a negation of all of these forms of identity. So he takes on the very strong darqawa kind of way of tasawwuf, which is wearing the muraqqa and patch cloak and having a misbah tied around your neck and going around the streets of Fez, dumping the garbage out and carrying it on oneself, just and going in the same places where you're formerly known as a big scholar. So I'm just conscious of time because I know I've been speaking for very long and I've actually not been looking at time, and I think I've gone beyond an hour. So any further questions and answers before we wrap things up? I think Abu Madian.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, sorry. I just as I said, I still have like an unstable internet. So
Okay.
yeah, it's up to you. I mean, you are free to continue talking. Yeah. So there's no time limit, as I told you before. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I've kind of said most of what I wanted to say. If no one has any questions, then I'll wrap things up. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy talking. I've noticed a few familiar names have just logged in or are here. Has anyone actually got the book and they've actually there's something about it they want to ask? I did mention to Abu Madin I will be teaching the book a bit more formally in the near future, maybe from the 14th of June or the 15th of June. So if you're interested, it will be through the International Students of Islamic Psychology. We're trying to start like a formal institute of learning called the Radisho Institute. This will be its first pilot course. So the idea is that this will be just like an initial way of kind of introducing that institute, and then we'll do some more Islamic psychology stuff. But if you're interested, that will be a paid course in which I'll be covering the book in detail. So kind of 10 structured lessons on each of the chapters. So I'm not hearing anything from anyone. How do we get more information about that course? Good question. Okay. Maybe Abu Madin, if you do post this up, actually, if this is let me see, I might be able to actually post it right now in the chat. So because I think I have it on my WhatsApp. I have the details here. So if I could just, I'll post it now. In the meantime, any other questions? Seeing some of the details here. Yeah, so I'm actually going to post this into the Zoom in the hope that it actually comes in the Zoom. Let's see if I can post it up here. Control V. Yeah. Oh, I posted quite a lot about it. Hang on. I posted it, but then it seems to exceed the word limit. So here's should come now. Okay. It says starting date 14th June. It most likely will be 15th of June. And instead of Saturdays 12 p.m., it would be Sundays 12 p.m. GMT. Okay, great. I'll send you the links later, Abu Madian. Andila Jabbar, nice to see you, Andila. Exactly how I found the point at the beginning with Jabal and learning just how each path has the and how different souls align to get the point. Yeah, it's interesting that the so just maybe it interests you, Andela, and also others in the course of my research, and you might find this often different people kind of speaking about, you know, we start here, the Shadhlis start here, and the Naqshbandis end there, and our starting is the ending of the Shadhli. Our starting is where they end, and their ending is where they start. And broadly speaking, in the spiritual literature, you could find two broad categories of methods with regards to suluk. One of them could be called the direct path, and the other could be called the indirect path. And so what does that mean? So the direct path would be to some capacity what Ibn Āģībah is speaking about, and at the level of personification, in its probably more contemporary, like very demonstrative form, it would be someone like Sheikh al-Alawi al-Mustaghanawi from Algeria, in the sense that people would come and they would either, Sheikh al-Alawi's, they would put people into the khalwa, like a spiritual retreat. And the idea literally with the spiritual retreat was that they would get a direct experiential taste of fana. So it's not theory. And it's interesting, Sheikh Al-Alawi would put, farmers and different, there wasn't, I mean, obviously that would be to the Sheikh's role to determine the different degrees of readiness for the adherents, but as a methodology, it was to expose people very much from the outset to what is the goal. And there was a teacher we have here in Dubai who's from Sheikh Al-Alawi's lineage, which is a Shadhli lineage. So it went from the Darqawa to the Al-Alawiyya. That's a continuation of that lineage. And Sheikh he's from Yemen, this particular teacher. So I was describing to him another spiritual path, which often calls itself Ghazalian, to take like step by step. And this is the kind of methodology which also is alluded to by Ibn Āģībah, which is very much like the Minhaj al-Abidin, that you have this aqaba, you have this obstacle, and you have to go past this obstacle, and then you have to go past this obstacle, and you have to go past this obstacle, and you have to work on you have to do a lot of tahliyah, remove these vices before you can do tahliyah. And this particular sheikh, and it was tongue in cheek, but it was a bit belittling, because he said, this path is دع على رأسك الحجر ثم تسعد. Such a path is put a boulder on your head and then try and go up the mountain. He says, as for our path is أعرف نفسك, know who you really are, ثم تنزل, and then descend from the mountain. Right? So it was a kind of a positing. This is the direct path. We just say we know who you are, and then you descend from the mountain. Now, my wife had a good rebuttal to that because she was kind of on this other path, right? This Ghazalian method. She said, well, you know what? The way I see it, sometimes it's good to go up the path because even with all the difficulties you're facing, you learn experience as a mountaineer and you get to the top and then you know how to come down. Whereas the other path seems like know who you are and fall off the mountain. So the direct path can have its casualties. So what's the casualties of the direct path? You get exposed to these realities and you don't have the psycho-emotional makeup to actually cope with them. And that's why we have sometimes, I mean, in extreme sense, you'd have someone turn to Jadab. Usually that's if they have majdub, that's if they don't have shuyukh. But even with shuyukh, you can have contemporary shuyukh who've exposed a lot of people in the khalwa. And then actually, if you're held accountable by what you know, sometimes their personal lives just break apart after that because they're not able to imbibe what's demanded, and then it can become more of a difficulty. So that's why it was very interesting that I was speaking to Sidi Harun Sugic, who wrote one of the most interesting contemporary kind of spiritual hagiographical kind of literatures of the different biographies of different teachers. And he mentioned a lot of his teachers from the Ba'alawi tradition would say the later the opening comes, the better. So it's very different to how we sometimes have the Western mentality where we want the direct method, which is, I can't wait to get my achievement, right? But it's more about, can you inculcate the adab and the psycho-emotional makeup until you are seeking things from correct position. And this is why Ibn ʿAjībah, a lot of his initial aphorisms about foundational degrees of undoing the ego in terms of how you're even seeking, so that the idea becomes you ultimately are a receptacle for this opening, and you have the capacity to be what it's asking of you, which is you be through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it's very possible for someone to get an opening and that nafs can come back and co-opt it and think sense of specialness. So there's an interesting thing that you have this combination of two, and the direct and indirect. And in practice, this is what I think Ibn ʿAjībah was saying by saying we join between the two, because if it's one, then they could have detriments, and the other detriment of the indirect way is potentially it could be if you may never arrive. Someone could constantly be thinking you have to keep working on yourself, and towards the end of the Hikam it says that if it was only until you do away with all of your claims that the arrival comes, then you'll never be able to arrive. But you arrive when غطى نعتك بنعته, when he covers your attribute with his attribute and your wasf with his wasf. So you arrive with him from what is from him to you, not from what is from you to him. So in many ways, the working on yourself is just to build the receptivity for يَخْتَصُ لِرَحْمَتِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ, for him to choose whomsoever he wants. But his rahmah is close to come to those who are the muhsineen. So it's just opening yourself up to be the receptacle through that adab. But it's also interesting that I think sometimes you have tariqas like the Ba'alawi, who say we are outwardly Ghazalian, we are inwardly Shadili, which is interesting because technically the Shadili lineage is not formally a connection of their lineage. It comes, the closest that you'd say was probably Abu Madian sent his khirqa, his cloak, to Faqih Muqaddam. But I think what they're trying to say with that is that we are outwardly this indirect way of working on ourselves, but inwardly we are this direct way of opening ourselves up to spiritual realities, which is a very balanced way of being, that you are outwardly sober, but you're inwardly intoxicated. So yeah, that helps, inshallah. Yeah, the Qadri method, I think, is a bit of everything, right? Similarly, I mean, these are terms that mean different things, but the beauty of the Qadri method is that all of these methods at some point pass through the Qadr. So, like what my teacher says, that the Shadhlis it's just another variation on the Qadris, because who was Sheikh Abu Hassan Shadhli? His teacher was Mawla Abdul Salam al-Mashish, and who was the teacher Mawla Abdul Salam al-Mashish? You're going through Ghawth al-Madyan, and who's that? Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani. So at some point, it's the Qadri tariqa. And the same thing with Ghawth Abu Madyan going to the Ba'alawis, yani through that, sending his khirqa. So the beauty is that the more you are connected to the prophetic methodology, the more you are jami'un. In other words, it's not one methodology fits all. The teacher is able to give different methodologies to different people dependent on their spiritual aptitude and receptivity. And actually, that's a sign of kamal, that's a sign of perfection and completeness, that the sheikh gives people different things based on what they need. So for some people, they need to be put into these spiritual retreats because because they have a ripeness for it. And to not put them in that would be delaying them. And for others, maybe a lot of people otherwise, that they need to be held into more integrated before such things can happen. So alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Any questions, comments? I think a lot of you agree with my wife. Yeah, she's alhamdulillah. She's perceptive in this regards.
Yeah, it makes much sense actually. Yeah, because you can go back and forth. I go top, go bottom, bottom, top.
We've
But
seen, Sidi Abu Madin, we've seen too many people fall off fall off the mat.
Exactly, and then the people who down and the who go up, they can go down and go up and then go down. I mean, they can do it many times back and forth, right?
Yes, inshallah. Khair. As long as
Yeah,
you keep striving, inshallah. That's the main thing,
yeah.
inshallah. So if that's okay with if there's no more questions, then inshallah we'll call it a day, and then inshallah I'll send you the details, Abu Madin, so you can send it to your list, inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah, Jazakallah khair, yeah.
Okay. سبحانك وبحمدك سبحان العظيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاك الله خير، بارك الله فيك.
وإياكم إن شاء الله.